Councilwoman, you're now live.
Thank you so much. Okay, it is 5:01 p.m. I'm going to call the March 16th, 2022 Quality of Life Committee meeting to order. Elizabeth, if I could please get a roll call.
Yes, ma'am. Chair, Councillor Cassette.
Here.
Councillor Michael Garcia.
Present.
Councillor Villarreal.
Present.
Councillor Lee Garcia.
Here.
Councillor Chavez.
Here.
You have a quorum, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Moving on to our next item, we have approval of the agenda. Are there any changes from staff?
There are no changes from staff, Counselor.
Thank you. Any changes from the committee? And if not, can I get a motion?
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay, I got a motion from Councillor Michael Garcia, second from Councillor Lee Garcia. If I can please get a roll call.
Chair Cassette.
Yes.
Councillor Michael Garcia.
Yes.
Councillor Villarreal.
Yes.
Councillor Lee Garcia.
Yes.
Councillor Chavez.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you so much. Moving on to item 4, approval of the consent agenda. Are there any items that members would like to pull? Councilwoman Villarreal?
Yes, I'd like to discuss item B as in boy.
Okay, thank you. Any other items to pull?
Go ahead.
Oh, Councilor Lee Garcia, go ahead.
Item A.
A as in apple.
A is an apple.
Anything else? And if not, what are the wishes of the committee?
Move to approve.
Second.
I have a motion from Councilor Michael Garcia, second from Councilor Chavez. Ms. Martin, a roll call vote, please.
Chair Cassette.
Yes.
Councillor Michael Garcia.
Yes.
Councillor Villarreal.
Yes.
Councillor Lee Garcia.
Yes.
Councillor Chavez.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you so much. Moving on to item 5, approval of the minutes from the March 2nd, 2022 Quality of Life Committee meeting. Are there any changes from staff?
There are no changes, Counselor Castro.
Thank you, Loretta. Any changes from the committee? And if not, what are the wishes of the committee?
Move to approve.
Second.
A motion from Councilwoman Villarreal, a second from Councilor Michael Garcia, and another roll call vote, if you please, Ms. Martin.
Yes, ma'am. Chair Cassette.
Yes.
Councillor Michael Garcia.
Yes.
Councillor Villarreal.
Yes.
Councillor Lee Garcia.
Yes.
Councillor Chavez.
Yes.
Did you say yes, Councillor Chavez?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you so much. All right, moving on to item 6, presentations. 6A is the Homelessness and Encampment Update from Community Health and Safety Department presentation. Kira Ochoa is here to present, and I believe that there are others, and I will let you introduce them. Kira, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. If you could promote Anna Kale Pendas into the meeting, that would be helpful. We also have 2 other guests from Las Cruces and from Denver, and Anna can invite those folks in, and we can begin.
Yes, ma'am. I've just let them in. They just got to accept.
Thank you so much. And so with that, I will ask Anna to share her screen. Hello, Anna Kale Pendas, Youth and Family Services Division Program Manager, and has done a substantial amount of work on our presentation for you tonight. As you know, I'm Kira Ochoa. We also have 2 guests. Anna, can you please name them and have them brought into the meeting as well?
Yes, I'm not seeing either of them on yet.
Maybe you can just let Alex know when if they come in, their names, please.
Yeah, Nicole Martinez is the Executive Director of the Mesilla Valley Community of Hope in Las Cruces, and Dr. Kathleen Van Voorhees, who does a lot of work around establishing sanctioned encampments in communities.
Great. So we're here to talk to you all tonight, Madam Chair, members of the committee, about different ideas for addressing unsheltered homelessness in Santa Fe, specifically in the short term. If we could go to slide 2, Anna. So Anna will talk to you about what we're looking at right now in Santa Fe.
Yeah, so we estimate that there are about 150 people who are sleeping outdoors or in places that are not meant for human habitation in Santa Fe at the moment. There's a lot of challenges that come with that. We have about 250 encampment reports that have come through our CRM system since April of 2020, 70 of which that are sort of currently sitting unresolved, meaning that those encampments are still active.
And we find that a lot of the nonprofits that are performing the street outreach, do a good job, but are still having trouble connecting to all clients, especially because people move around. And the key to getting people connected to services when they're unsheltered is building relationships with them. Many of folks have been through various attempts to be helped or get help, and that's been unsuccessful. So a lot of what the outreach folks and the experts in the community, such as LifeLink's outreach path team, our own MIHO group, Southwest Cares, what they seek to do is build relationships with people. The biggest challenges is, of course, if people are moving around a lot, that's hard. So prior to the pandemic, when I was the community services director, I spoke with our Parks and Recs director, our police chief at that time, and folks in our public works department. And we put together an estimate that we were spending about $3.4 million annually on encampments that would often be cleaned up and people would be asked to move on, only to pop up maybe 10 or 20 yards down the road from where they had been. So it was a real revolving door, and it was pretty ineffective. That 3.4 million was made up of $10,000 to $20,000 in some cases to clean up individual camps, as well as staff time from Parks and Recs workers, the police, and sometimes our fire teams, as well as the environment division.
So our current emergency proclamation details that we are working to prevent the spread of COVID-19, and the CDC recommends doing that by not moving encampments. So here's the language from our current emergency proclamation. It says that facilitating the continued application of the policy adopted to evaluate and address the public health and safety risks, including illegal activity of flash floods, environmental compliance of and locations of encampments. It goes on to talk about how this goes along with our Built for Zero work, which is the work that we're doing to address homelessness really holistically in Santa Fe. And so currently what that looks like is that we have encampments that are allowed to exist on city-owned lands, except for when they're in parks or near the Santa Fe River, which would contribute to an environmental concern.
And I will say that we feel confident that this strategy has helped in stopping the spread of COVID among homeless populations. Many of our shelters have told us that people did not feel comfortable inside a congregate shelter. Many people that outreach workers have relationships with have told us the same thing, that their strategy for staying COVID free was to be unsheltered in some cases. Of course, we're at a different moment in our pandemic, but I think that there are still many people who do not want to go into our congregate shelters.
And this next slide really goes into further detail about that CDC recommendation that allows for some unsheltered sleeping locations to serve as a really great way to socially distance and prevent the spread of COVID, particularly when there are not individual housing options like housing or hotels or non-congregate shelter options.
For that, I don't mean to interrupt you, Anna, but we also should note that our Midtown shelter was a huge strategy around stopping the spread of COVID, because those are individual rooms and individual dorm rooms. And that shelter remains full at this time. So it doesn't meet the entire need that is still out there.
That's correct. And while this practice that we've adopted has done tremendous work to reduce the spread of COVID-19, there are challenges that come with that. Our current practice really isn't the ideal solution for anyone. It's not ideal for the people who are sleeping outside, the people who are trying to serve them, or the neighboring businesses and residents that are feeling concern for their health and safety. So unsheltered homelessness and Built for Zero. For those who aren't aware, Built for Zero is an initiative that the city of Santa Fe joined in 2018. It's a international network at this point of communities that are all working towards the same goal of ending homelessness in their communities. And we see this work to address encampments as a really critical part of that process. We can't end homelessness unless we're ending it for everyone. And creating pathways to housing for people that don't require them to stay in a shelter is a critical part of that work. Being unsheltered kind of poses its own set of challenges to those individuals. Lack of access to sanitation services, weather protection, electricity, kind of really basic services. Things like rugged terrain and just lack of resources can make it really difficult to provide essential services to this subpopulation. Director Ochoa, do you want to speak to this?
Sure. So in the fall of last year, we commissioned a report from Amy Farrow-Weiss. This was in your packet, to look at short, medium, and long-term solutions for unsheltered homelessness. And I hope you've had a chance to take a look at that report. I think it's very interesting. Members of the public, I also would invite to take a look at it. Ms. Farrow-Weiss interviewed many unsheltered people here in Santa Fe and talked to them about some of their challenges and needs, as well as, looking at the nonprofit provider community and some of the impacts on the local community and neighbors for people. Her recommendation in that report is a short-term solution. It doesn't end people's homelessness, but it allows potentially for people to be better connected to services that will end their homelessness. And it would be managed camping. And we, looked at the number of people that we estimate to be out there to be potentially 150, although that's not an perfectly accurate count. So we don't really want sites that have more than 25 people or so. So we're looking at potentially up to 4 designated areas. We're assuming we're not going to have, be able to serve every single person who's out there, but we can start perhaps with 4 scattered sites, serving no more than 25 people in different parts of the city. These designated encampments potentially could have support, they would have to have support infrastructure to keep people warm, hygiene services, and safety services for the encampment as well as surrounding community. We do have our mobile hygiene unit in play. We're hoping to hire folks into that, and we do see that as something that would contribute to providing the hygiene. And we've spoken to some of our neighboring, for our nonprofit partners, about what they might be willing to do to support these encampments should we as a city decide to go forward with them. The picture you see there is from Camp Hope in Las Cruces, and those are structures. They started out as tents on pallets and now sort of sort of shed-like structures. The photo on the left is something you can get at Home Depot for, I think it's $250. It's like a greenhouse hoop house that would hold heat, and you could also put tents inside of those. But there are a number of different structures that could be looked at as possible dwellings.
So as we've kind of started to form some of these plans and strategies around looking at what this may look like in our community, there's some rules for these sites that are generally recommended through communities that have done this in the past, but also working with, as Director Ochoa mentioned, we had that report commissioned, and that consultant did tremendous work in gathering input from community providers and people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness in our community. And so some of these rules came directly from that work. And it's pretty basic. But the emphasis is really around health and safety and protecting both the individuals who are going to be in these sites and the neighboring community. So no open drug or alcohol use, no violence, sites being limited to a smaller number of individuals, no children, quiet hours, no intoxicated or disruptive behavior, the expectation that sites are kept clean and tidy, and that clothing is worn when people are visible. Additionally, we have been working with our friends at the fire department to look at additional fire safety measures. Fire suppression and fire prevention are big concerns with things like this. So additional rules around that, around no open fires, including propane cooking grills, no open flames really of any kind for any reason. And our fire department is working to put together some additional fire guidelines. Again, as we've been forming this plan, using the recommendations that came from the report that we commissioned, as well as our own local information gathering, we've looked at a set of criteria that would help to determine what these sites could be. And there's some elements of sites that are really critical to making this a successful project, like access for emergency vehicles, trash pickup, close to public transit routes, away from areas that provide or that pose a risk to fire or flood, areas that pose a risk to water quality, and ideally not abutting any homes, businesses, schools, playgrounds, and on city-owned land.
Here, of course, we have to look at the risks that would be involved in designating encampments. We would be, as these would be on city property, we would hold the full liability for the project. And we have to acknowledge, though, that we have liability currently in that we don't have support for the encampments that are being allowed. And, you know, as our recent fire shows and other issues that arise from unsanctioned encampments, we have risk when we ignore illegal camping as well, or continue to condone it. Management of the sites, so we have been meeting with our risk folks to talk about what this looks like, as well as our legal folks. Management of the sites, including security, management of guests, and monitoring for illegal or hazardous behavior, and then for environmental safety concerns and hazards would be key. We also really need to look at, as in addition to all of our fire regulations, how dense the sites are in terms of the tents. Do we have an adequate number of toilets, parking spaces, and other services proportionate to the number of individuals that might be allowed in certain sites?
With that, we have some really great opportunities and resources at our disposal. We have excellent relationships with both public and private partners, including philanthropic partners, other government bodies, nonprofits. We have an abundance of city-owned land.
I'll say that, sorry, I'll butt in a little here. Obviously, under normal circumstances, when our emergency proclamation is not in place, camping is not allowed on city property. It's interesting to note that there is an exception in our city code for permitted camping in parks. And we also have approximately 30 areas designated as parks that are not currently in use as parks. So that may be an opportunity as well to look at, where if there were things that are technically designated as parks, but community is not using as a park, would these perhaps be appropriate sites? I will say too that I'm very interested and I've been talking with our police department about the program where we have mobile homes in parks, and police have historically lived there in those places. And if we were to potentially purchase additional mobile homes for designated encampment areas, would we have police officers who might be interested in living in these spots very low, at very low cost for a certain period of time to provide additional security or sense of security? So that's something we're exploring as well. And then, I'm sorry, the last thing is just because the Community Health and Safety Department exists, we're able to have some of these conversations across the departments, with the fire department, with the police department, with community services, and youth and family services division. So we feel like, you know, we're just in an opportunity moment in terms of how we can potentially coordinate these things.
There's some myths about homelessness locally that we hear really often whenever these conversations come up. A couple of those that we hear just in every conversation are that the homeless people here are not from here. And our partners at the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness have some data that really does not support that. 28% of the households in their coordinated entry system report being from Santa Fe their entire life, or at least having been here 30 plus years. Another 17% of those folks report being from other parts of New Mexico. So really, this is a local challenge. This is our community, and they're a community that we need to serve. Another thing that we hear really often is that this is a group of people that doesn't want help. And as Director Ochoa mentioned a bit earlier in the presentation, a lot of times people will go through the process of trying to be engaged in services, and those services don't pan out. And it can be really discouraging for people to then continue to try over and over and over again to get services from a system that has let them down several times. And some people choose to get their needs met through alternative actions, as you know, these sort of traditional systems have let them down. So they might do things like panhandling or camping to try and meet their needs through ways that are a little bit more independent. This model that we're exploring is not new. It's used in cities across the country that have sanctioned encampments that look a lot of different ways. Some that are sort of our neighbors are Las Cruces. There's the Mesilla Valley Community of Hope is a nonprofit organization that provides services to people experiencing homelessness. And they have a camp, it's called Camp Hope, outside of their space that they have operated for about 10 years now. And that camp is very much integrated with the way that they provide their services indoors, outdoors. It's the critical element of that is that it's very connected to services, and it is a pathway towards housing. Denver, Colorado recently set up these, they call them safe outdoor spaces, or SOS. They opened 2 locations in parking lots as a COVID response. And recently, I think about a month ago, added an additional about $4 million to expand that project, as they've seen really tremendous success in that being a pathway to get people stable and ready to move into housing. And it does not look like either of our guests have been able to join us. I don't know if there's a Zoom challenge there, but maybe at a future update, they'll be able to provide some more information there. So as we start to form this plan, some of the things that we're looking at, again, looking at sort of best practices of how this works in other communities, using the report that we've commissioned, and thinking about what's just really practical for Santa Fe, given our resources and challenges. Is looking at providing toilets and hand washing stations, contracting outreach and site support from our nonprofit partners, including things of housing, harm reduction, healthcare, and behavioral healthcare. Looking at identifying camp stewards or using park rangers as supports. As Director Ochoa mentioned, we have the mobile hygiene unit that we have at our disposal to provide on-site hygiene services. We would want to provide potable water, protection from weather, ongoing monitoring from city staff using our police, fire, and other resources, and then looking at having sort of tech options and security cameras and other ways to monitor the project. We're putting together sort of a rough budget as we're coming up with a bit of a rough plan. And this is a bit of what we're looking at right now. We've gotten some quotes from providers and partners that would be willing to provide some of these services, including some of our own, our trash pickup through our City of Santa Fe Environmental Services Division, who is interested in partnering with us on this. We hope that if this comes to fruition, that this can be a pathway to housing services. This will lead to neighborhoods feeling cleaner and safer. This will show the community that we are engaged and responsive to concerns. And this really plays a big role in what we're already doing with our Built for Zero work to address homelessness holistically. Director Ochoa, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think that, you know, ideally we would be housing people and not sanctioning encampments. The reality is not everybody's ready to be housed. And as Ms. Pendas mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, reestablishing relationships of trust between folks that have been out of the system, living unsheltered for a long, long time, with skilled outreach workers and others who are willing to find out who they are as individuals and what they might need to be housed, is a goal that would come out of this. So what is success with this project? We'd love to see fewer reports from our community of encampments around the city. We have 70 active now. You know, if we could reduce that significantly, I'd say by, 50 to 75%, that would be a success. This would allow us to ramp out of our emergency proclamation, which currently allows camping on city property. And we could start to disallow it and say, but you can be here, because that's the biggest issue right now, is that when people go previous to the pandemic, to talk to folks who are living unsheltered, they say, well, where can I be? And if we have a place that they can be, then we can enforce them not being in places we don't want them to be. We'd like to see a decrease in that revolving door of people in a public safety system. I talked to the behavioral health director out at the county jail, who says there are about 15 folks that go in and out of jail in a revolving door, who get detoxed in jail, come out, and are sometimes back in jail within 48 hours because they have no place to land that works for them. And potentially these encampments might be that for some of those folks. We would see an increase in engagement of anybody living in an unsanctioned encampment with support services, because there would be support services present. Case managers and navigators would know where to find their clients. They wouldn't be in the wind, which is a phrase that they use a lot to say, we don't know where this person is until they pop up in the emergency room in jail or somewhere else. Ultimately, of course, we want to see the project leading to many more individuals being housed.
So as we're sort of putting together the short-term plan, we're also still working really diligently to come up with, as Director Ochoa put it really well, sort of a launching pad into what comes next. At this time, we really don't have all of the housing resources that we even need to be able to house everyone, if that was what we wanted to do. which is where we find ourselves with these stopgap solutions. Other solutions, other communities use these pallet shelters, which are, I wish I had a picture of them. They're a little bit more of, they almost look like a pop-up shed, similar to the ones that we saw in the photo from Mesilla Valley. But they ship in a pallet and they can pop up in less than an hour. And Grand Junction, Colorado recently set up a little village of these pallet shelters to support people who choose to sleep outdoors because they can't go into shelter with their pets. And so this was an option for them to be able to provide that alternative solution. As we've spoken about, there's a lot of reasons that people don't go indoors, and it's sometimes as simple as that, not wanting to be separated from their pet or their partner or their family member. So we're looking at exploring a lot of different options in terms of what this could look like and what these solutions could be for serving this population. And with that, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness strongly advises that as cities are considering developing these, that there is a very strong emphasis on investing in longer-term housing solutions. And that this isn't something where communities are just setting up encampments and saying, well, this is good enough for now, and then moving on to other issues, but to really look at this as a short-term project that can lead to long-term permanent housing. And that's something I think that we're very focused on as we've been having these conversations and putting together these plans, is figuring out the role that this plays within those larger plans that we have to address homelessness holistically in our community. And that this is temporary. This would be a short-term solution.
So thinking about middle and longer term and what might come next, we have in the Community Health and Safety Department proposed a new investment that would be an RFP that would allow us to refurbish a local property that would be more of a campus, more of a community of hope style model like they have in Las Cruces, where we wouldn't just have an encampment, we'd have an emergency shelter, perhaps larger, more conducive to better neighborhood relations in its location, and also behavioral health services, whether it's additional harm reduction services, stronger partnerships with our La Sala Crisis Center, or on-site supports. The facility would be, you see a phrase here, would include transitional wet housing. Wet housing means that people would be allowed to use drugs and alcohol in a safe, controlled manner. Not everybody is ready to be, or wanting to be sober. And if we don't have a housing first model, we're going to continue to have an unsheltered people problem. This model of co-located services has already been used, as I mentioned, in many places around the country, including with good success in Las Cruces. I had a chance to visit Community of Hope a few years ago, and I think it would be very valuable to see how that works in Las Cruces, because it's pretty impressive in terms of how well managed the unsheltered encampment area is, as well as the services that support it all. With that, we are here to stand for questions.
Sharing.
Thank you so much, Director Ochoa. And before I move to questions, first of all, thank you both for the presentation and the report and all of the work and thought and research that has gone into this. I think that is important that we recognize what a complex issue this is. And so I really want to thank both of you and all the individuals you've been working with for putting this together. this is not easy. There are no easy solutions here. So really, thank you so much for being here today. There's a term that is frequently used, and if you are in the field, it's very familiar, but other people may not know it, and that's harm reduction. So I was hoping that before we jump to questions, if we could get a definition of harm reduction from you all.
Sure, I'll do my best here. I don't have all my experts in the field in the wings, but basically harm reduction, well, if you think about it, wearing a seatbelt is harm reduction. So, we drive cars, and that's one of the most dangerous things we can do, but we wear seatbelts because we're going to drive cars, and that's a form of harm reduction. But really, in this realm, we're talking about people who are using drugs and alcohol, being supported to use drugs and alcohol more safely. So you'll see things like needle exchange programs, which say, we know people are going to need to inject drugs, and we want to make sure they don't, get diseases or share needles. And so we're doing these needle exchange programs. We've been in interesting conversations with someone who's been doing research into managed alcohol programs, such as the kind they have in Canada for decades now, where longtime alcoholics, who sometimes resort to, drinking substances that are very dangerous and deadly, are acknowledged to be alcoholics, but acknowledged that they may not be able to stop using alcohol. And then so their alcohol use is supported with medical professionals in certain sites. And, around the country, we are seeing increased safe use sites for illegal drugs. And that's something that we might want to look at here in Santa Fe as well, in terms of a pilot with UNM or another partner, because this is proving very effective, both in terms of saving lives, but ultimately in getting folks stabilized, and in some cases out of use of drugs, but not all.
Yeah, thank you so much for going into that in a little bit more detail, Kira, because I know it's first time I heard that term. What is this? So want to make
Thank you.
sure.
Sorry, we do get a little wonky in our world sometimes.
We do. We forget that. But thank you. I will now go ahead and turn to the committee. If there are any questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. Councilor Chavez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you. I want to echo what Councilor Cassette said, and just trying to tackle this issue. I think that the thing that stands out to me, and this is more of a comment, and I imagine that this is going to be the case, and the biggest concern for you is just staffing. Because I think of these things like if we have like safe use, how that's going to require staffing to kind of control and see through. If we have certain facilities or resources, how will that be managed? Public safety and having their involvement. And, just the thought of this though, and actually going through the process and doing the work, I think is a huge step forward and a huge accomplishment. But I think the next huge hurdle is probably going to be the actual human resources that it'll take to make sure that this can be done in a successful and safe way. Where we are actually, and that's just Built for Zero in general, right, requires that staffing to really make a huge impact. So, I acknowledge that's probably going to be one of your biggest concerns and probably one of the bigger hurdles kind of to get by. But I did want to thank you for starting this, because there's two sides and it's going to be very difficult to get an understanding of the why this is necessary. It really takes that empathy. It involves empathy. And, people, I know what I've often heard from constituents is people saying, well, if we have something like this, or if we like shelters, if you don't allow them to use drugs or to use alcohol, then they'll leave the city. And I'm like, no, that's not the case. They're just going to find a way where they can function, because at that point in addiction, they need it to survive. And I'm just really impressed with that acknowledgement by you all. So thank you for that. I would love to hear ideas that you have about staffing. I know we have great partners, and thank goodness, because that would probably be a huge help in that process or exploring that. But that's going to be a giant challenge right now, just where the city stands.
Madam Chair, Councillor Chavez, thank you for the question. Yes, I think when we look at, again, the short, medium, and long term, obviously the medium and long term, where we would have, full partnership with a nonprofit or more than one nonprofit, would be pretty labor intensive and staff intensive. The short term solution, we intentionally looked at what could actually be done in the short term. And as Anna mentioned, this idea of camp stewards emerged. These would be people who are peers, who are unsheltered themselves, who are stable, have chosen not to live in shelter, have not been able or willing to go into housing, but would be willing to partner with a local nonprofit who could give stipends and support so that rules in encampments could be followed, and consensus among the group that is allowed to camp could be maintained. This is what they do in Mesilla Valley, and it's pretty low barrier in terms of staffing. There's one staff person present at the camp, but not 24/7. The camp stewards themselves are the ones who actually maintain order at the camp. So, case managers and navigators for our mobile hygiene unit, we're finding we didn't get many applicants. So that's a huge challenge, but workforce in that field, it's a challenge all around. Can't deny that. I think this proposal for the short term goes with the grain, acknowledging that we don't have a lot of staff, and works with potentially a nonprofit partner who's willing to run that program, as well as our city services that are in many ways working very inefficiently right now because all of our encampments are so dispersed around the city. So it's potentially a way to actually address the fact that we do have a staffing shortage. We would rather our police department not have to go out to 70 encampments and assess, or our fire department. So it could potentially be a smarter way to work on this issue in the short term.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for diving into this and sharing all this with us this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Chavez. Councillor Lee Garcia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank you for the presentation. Very good information. How do you take this from the theory and the concept to actual implementation? And it's been cold out, so a lot of the encampments are kind of hidden in places. Where do we identify strategically throughout the city where they would be placed? And that's just my first question. Going back to a point that Councillor Chavez brought up was the staffing, the people, and not only the people that are working there to help those that are less fortunate, that are unhoused, keeping them safe, because there's a lot of activity around a lot of these encampments, and I think that would be one of my major concerns. And obviously providing the resources to them that they need to hopefully get them into a more stable situation, and doing that as quickly as possible for their health, for the community's health, and everything. And so I don't know if that could be maybe addressed a little bit. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Councillor Garcia, thank you for the question. So I think that in terms of the operationalizing this, yeah, I think that's going to be a conversation with all of you, with all of the members of the governing body, with all of as many constituents as we can engage in that conversation around potential locations. That's when, the the real hard conversations are going to have to be had around where. I think that in terms of safety, we hope that designating up to 4 locations would allow us to concentrate our public safety resources better than they've been concentrated right now and in the past, as well as, the support services that are currently being provided in these places. So I think that, the locations, as we laid out some of the criteria in the presentation, if we can designate places that are sort of technically known as parks but are not being used as parks, that would be very interesting to explore, because those sites might be appropriate sites that are not going to be environmental hazards. They're not potentially going to be impacting. I think one of the models that is in the report you received is that there would be a local advisory board of businesses, neighbors, and others who would ensure that things were going well at these sites. And if they weren't, there'd be a way to have those conversations proactively. Again, this is something that the governing body will need to decide whether they want to explore or not. And as not the long-term solution, I guess one criteria for evaluation would be, is it working better than what we have currently or not? And if it's not, there's no reason to continue it. But I think that I hope that answers the question a little bit, or enough.
Yeah. Again, back to how do we solve this? I mean, I don't think there's ever going to be a full solution to it all, because there's so many people that are in need, and not everybody, like you said, wants to be in a situation where they have to follow certain criteria in order to be there. And yet you still see the people that are in need of a place to sleep, a place to shower, hygiene, you name it. Just the other day, I gave a guy a ride out to Caja del Rio area. He lives out there in a tent. And so he's on National Forest land, and, where do they get the services that they need? And, so I think this is headed in the right direction. And I hope that with the right resources and not just providing the services, but proper accountability for people. I think that's really what the key is. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Lee Garcia, if you can take your hand down, that would be helpful for me. Thank you so much. Councilwoman Villarreal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, staff, for making this a priority. And I know that you hear from us a lot, and it's just a hard place to try to find this balance where we want people to be safe that are experiencing homelessness, as well as a place that they feel like they could transition out of, and also have people that live in the area feel safe as well. This report was super comprehensive. I wish we could have heard from Amy Farrow-Weiss, because the St. Francis Homelessness Challenge, I've never heard of that before. And it's a 106-page document. I only got through half of it because I kept going back and forth in certain sections, trying to read more closely and try to understand it. And I think for people that, I think for some people, it would be hard to comprehend some of the aspects of this present or the commissioned report. And I think it was extremely helpful and thorough. I think some people will have a hard time comprehending because they haven't experienced homelessness. They don't have to deal with a substance use disorder or mental illness. And so all those things combined makes for someone that has privilege, like most of us, hard to how does this work? How does this work? So I just want to note that because, people, it's not a crime to be homeless. And also, by human nature, people want connection of some kind. And so when we hear folks in the community say, well, why are they out in encampments? There's shelters. And yes, we do have room in our shelters. That I just want to note that. It's just, there's a preference. And you did mention some of those that I think are important about not everybody wanting to be in shelters because of privacy issues. It's disruptive. I mean, I guess I've never slept in shelters, and I could probably guess that you don't sleep very much because there's a lot of people, coming and going and trying to sleep as well. So I just want to note that because I think it's hard to comprehend some of these things for those of us that haven't had that kind of experience. So the other thing I want to mention is, or just comment on, is I've been to the Community of Hope, and the reason why it's successful is it has integrated services. And those of you that haven't been there, it has a lot of different ways that people can be supported. There's a soup kitchen there. There's a food pantry. There's a childcare facility for people who are experiencing homelessness so they can leave their kids while they look for work or go to a job. The weather is very different in Las Cruces. They can have encampments all year, and it's different for us when we actually have, seasons where it's very frigid. So those things come to mind when I think about this. And so when we think more about managed camping, we know it's a temporary solution. I think the one thing that will come up for staff and then for us as counselors is how to explain about what it means to say no open use of drugs and alcohol in the encampments. And so when you say open use, that means out in the public. So they're welcome. I'm assuming what you meant is that if people are in their own tents, in their own space, they could be doing whatever they want to do. Is that correct? Is that what?
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Villarreal, yes.
So I think,
and the good thing would be that we'd have support for, overdoses present. We'd have other supports, but, one point of view on all of this is that, people who are in their homes using drugs and alcohol are in their homes using drugs and alcohol. And that's part of why it's not a problem. Right. And part of why the whole sort of knot of, unshelteredness and substance use disorder becomes so thorny is simply because people don't have a place to do this, whereas others do. So that's the harm reduction.
Right.
idea.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, because people are doing that regardless of what income level they come from. They're doing that in their homes anyway. So I appreciate what Councilwoman Chavez says about empathy, because I think that is something that is going to come up, and what empathy, how we can explain. I mean, empathy is really an individual aspect, I think. So I think we're just going to have to really dig into that community engagement piece that you mentioned. And it also talks about in the report pretty thoroughly about the need to be proactive and communicate ahead of time about what we're thinking about and what it will look like. And I appreciate that you did that myth busting about people don't want help. That's not true. People are not from here. And it looks like from what you said in your report, about 46% are from Santa Fe and or New Mexico. So I think that's good to note. I think the question I have at this point, because I think there's still a lot of things to work out, is about the potential sites, and if you all have identified potential locations for these sanctioned encampments.
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Villarreal, we have not. We did start out looking at the idea of one large place, and we looked at potential city-owned property for that. And then as this work has evolved, and the report, really in the short term, we do not have a nonprofit partner willing to operate a larger scale site at this time. that nobody in the community has that capacity right now. So if we wanted to do something, say, before our next emergency order ends, we don't have that capacity. And so we started to shift to the idea of more dispersed sites, up to 4 dispersed sites. And we have not identified those beyond to say it would be good to have them meeting the criteria that Anna laid out, and also probably in different parts of the city. With this population that's already living unsheltered, as much as it's possible to go with the grain of where people know and are, that would be an ideal. But we do also have, as I alluded to in our city code, this interesting provision that allows for camping. So I think we're working with Melissa McDonald in the Parks Division, identifying some of those sites that are called parks but not used by people as parks, and to see where those are. And I think we would need a very robust community engagement process, so that we're not springing this on any one community or another, and that there's engagement from you all, from your constituents, and all of the people that might be impacted by doing this, if we decide to do it.
Thank you. And that was actually my next question about the approval process, or kind of timeline you're working from. Will this come to governing body for final approval? And in between that time, if that's the case, what's your kind of time frame to start mapping this out and looking at the, creating a pilot project?
So, Madam Chair, Councilman Villarreal, elements of this would come before committees and governing body for approval. And if we link it in any way to the emergency proclamation, that part would be coming before governing body. But in terms of timeline, right now we're in a bit of a holding pattern with our emergency proclamation language, allowing camps and camping on some city property. But I think there's sort of pressure, as we're seeing, frustration about encampments mounting, frankly, to do something about that. So we would certainly not, we would want this to be a transparent process, and whether or not we're required to bring it before governing body, I think it would be very appropriate that we do in terms of what we're looking at. So I would intend that we do that in some fashion, and I don't know the details on how that would work exactly yet.
But you're putting things in motion possibly before the summer?
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Villarreal, we'd like to be ready to go should we be given a green light. So we do have a sole source posted that would allow us to partner with a local provider who would run the Steward program and do the outreach to these places should it go forward. We want to be ready to go with something, ideally, yes, by summertime, by before summertime. We're in a crisis. Everyone's frustrated. All of our services are tapped, and I think we need to consolidate and try something different. Frankly, that's my opinion. But we're putting the pieces in place in order to be able to do that, should we decide to do that, and hopefully, yes, by summer or sooner.
Yep. Yeah, I think time is of the essence, especially now that it's going to be warmer. And then when we have our monsoon season, which always concerns me when people are in arroyos or waterways, that's just not safe for anybody, including people that are camping in those areas. I also see like the connection that you're saying about our nonprofit partners. They already have street outreach. And if there's a consolidated area, I think that would be easier than trying to go all over town as well. So yeah, I'm interested in this for sure moving forward, and just wanting to make sure we have all the pieces in place as Councilor Garcia talked about, because yeah, there's definitely staff that's needed to make sure this is successful.
Madam Chair, Councilman Villarreal, if I may, just to clarify this question around staff, What we would need from the city staff side would be our mobile hygiene unit folks in place, which they're currently not. Those positions are being advertised for. Ms. Pendas would be the program manager for the project, so she's in place. And then, you know, our environment division has already said that they would support with trash pickup. We'd have porta potties in these places. That would be a contracted service. And then we'd have our contract with our nonprofit provider who would do the outreach and the oversight of the steward program. So really the staff part is our mobile hygiene unit team, and that's it.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the whole picture, not just staff, but also contracted services, because as we've seen with the nonprofit sector, they're short-staffed right now and they're not filling their positions for various reasons. So that's what I'm thinking about, the whole picture. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilor Michael Garcia.
Thank you, Chair Cassett. And thank you, Director Ochoa and Anna, for your presentation tonight. I really appreciate it. A lot of the questions I had were answered or asked by my colleagues, so definitely appreciate that. Going last, I guess, has a plus in that sense. Going through the presentation, you had mentioned that we hope to have a reduction in 50 to 75% of the population, which is, I think you had estimated at around 150 folks. And so with that being said, the site or sites would have 20 to 25 per site. So running off those numbers, just kind of going off quickly in my head, we would need 3 to 4 sites to meet that initial goal. Is that what we're looking at, is 3 to 4 sites?
Madam Chair, Councilor Garcia, yes, that's our estimate.
Okay. I wish our folks from Denver and Las Cruces were in, because I know that recently the city of Albuquerque, who did their tiny home village, which is a bit more, I don't want to say sophisticated, but they're tiny homes, not tents, not pallet shelters. And they're having some challenges with their sites. I think it was, maybe they're feeling that they had like an 80% vacancy rate. And, you know, some of the challenges, or I think a lot of it revolved around the requirements for the guests, you know, the no drug usage, whether it's before you enter the as a resident or during residency, and some of the other requirements. And so that kind of filtered out a lot of applicants. They didn't make it to become a resident. And so I guess, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, Anna, Director Ochoa, but if not, if you can get back to us, what does that look like, for example, in Las Cruces or Denver in regards to their vacancy rates? Are they at 100% capacity? Are they seeing some of those challenges as well? Because ultimately, I think if we do commit to this type of investment, we want to ensure that we're supporting as many of our community members as possible. Because I wouldn't want us to have an 80% vacancy rate in one of these tent or pellet communities. So I don't know, Anna, if Director Cho, if you know how that's working out in Las Cruces or Denver in regards to the vacancy rates.
Madam Chair, Councilor Garcia, I will say that we did learn from our guests that they were unable to join because the link didn't work. So they were trying, but unfortunately they couldn't get in. So maybe we can bring them back at another time and answer some of those details. Anna, do you know the answer to Councilor Garcia's question?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but I am happy to look into that. You know, I think earlier Councilwoman Villarreal asked about sort of the open drug use question, and that's largely sort of where that comes from, is understanding that putting these prohibitive barriers to projects like this can lead to having underutilized programs.
I think the most successful programs, in my understanding, really emphasize behavior, because not everybody's behavior is violent or unsociable when they're using drugs. That's really, so it's focusing on the behavior rather than the drug use that tends to make these projects more successful. I think that, we had people that interviewed for the encampment report that Amy Farrow-Weiss did, and I think 18 people were interviewed, and 100% of those said that they would be able, or felt that they would be able to adhere to those guidelines, and would understand if they didn't, they couldn't stay. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at as well. Those outdoor encampments in Las Cruces, when I was there, this is years ago, they were fully utilized, and that was something that worked well for some people.
Okay, thank you so much for providing some clarification. And then if we can just learn a little more, just because I think if we can learn from what's working with potential other, with other sites, let's use that to our benefit. I just also want to echo some of the comments my colleagues made in regards to services. I think it's critical that we have wraparound services at every one of these sites should we move forward with this project. Those are the type of services that help us provide a lifting hand up to community folks, and sometimes it's just that little extra help that will get somebody transition from homelessness to part-time temporary shelter to full-time housing. And I think that should be our ultimate goal, is providing these services to our community members that can ultimately lead to the long-term benefit of our city and the residents of our city. And as they are productive residents as well of our city, I think it should be the goal of this type of project. But I thank you for the presentation. As the ball gets moving, I'm definitely interested in a timeline. Happy to, help out. I think, one of the challenges we tend to see when we begin these type of initiatives is where these locations will be. And I appreciate the mindset of being proactive and working with the communities. So just as we move down that process, I think it would be great for the counselors to be involved, wherever these locations are, that way we can treat this as a community engagement process, and we're all working together. But thank you, Director Ochoa, and thank you, Anna, for the presentation tonight. I really appreciate it. And that's all I got, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lee Garcia, I do see that your hand is back up. And Councillor Michael Garcia, can you take your hand down? Thank you, sir. Councillor Lee Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just, I guess one more comment after listening to my colleagues here is, obviously the intent is to get as many people to help as possible. And, talking to many community members that express their concerns about the parks, not being able to utilize them, the arroyos, walking down the trails, and finding needles and things of that nature and safe. And so the whole idea, and my observation again, is to remove these people from those areas, because the people who are homeless obviously need the help. But what does enforcement of that look like once these are in place, and how do you address, or who addresses those issues when there is somebody that's sleeping in the dugouts at wherever, Salvador Perez or Regal Park or something of that nature? And I think that's the enforcement side of it, which a lot of us obviously have to look at as well. And so last question, thank you.
Madam Chair, Councilor Garcia, thank you for that question. I think it's important. So previous to our emergency proclamation, which does allow camping on city property, on some city property, we had an enforcement procedure that we would, I imagine, return to, which is, we receive a report of an encampment, we assess that is on city property. What kind of property? Is it public, private, or city property, or other state property? And then essentially the people in that encampment would receive a warning that they need to vacate that encampment, whether it's verbal if they're there, or a written notification. And then, within 24 hours, typically, our team from Parks or a contracted service would come and clean that encampment up, if sometimes accompanied by police if need be. And that enforcement would begin again once we had designated areas that we could tell people they could go to. So that would be added to the sweeping, as it's known, of these camps. And hopefully we see an effectiveness around that camp not popping up again, 20 feet down the line, if there's an alternative place for folks to go, where many people that our consultants spoke to said, yes, please, tell us where we could go. In fact, I'm sorry if you can indulge me, Madam Chair, in 1 second. I was driving the fire department van the other day, and I was in the CVS parking lot. And because our fire department does such a tremendous job serving our unsheltered folks, a couple guys came up and said, do you have any sleeping bags? And I said, oh no, I don't have any sleeping bags. But we started this conversation, and ultimately I did get them sleeping bags. But they were talking about if they only had a place that they knew it would be okay for them to be, how great that would be. So again, hopefully we'd have less work to do enforcing once the word got out that there were places where you can go and places where you can't go. But we would begin the enforcement process very similar to what we've done in the past and what we are currently doing in our waterways or in our city parks.
Thank you for that response. No more further questions.
Thank you very much, Counselor. I'll take a couple moments. My colleagues did a wonderful job asking a lot of the questions I had as well, and I appreciate the conversation. I do also want to reiterate some of the comments about those wraparound services, and there was those comments about fire safety, of making sure people aren't using propane grills or things that could be a fire hazard. And so I believe that what would be important for us is to make sure that there are resources for food, whether that is a sanctioned safe cooking area or partnering with some of our nonprofits. Some of, the Food Depot, of course, comes to mind, of who provides a lot of food for individuals in our community, but how we can make it as easy as possible for individuals to follow those rules by providing those necessities. And it sounds like that's something that's already really being thought about. We've had a lot of conversations about this, but making it as low barrier as possible. And I don't know kind of the difference between what exactly a wet encampment might look like as opposed to you can utilize within your home. And so, Kira, can you speak to that a little bit, if there is a difference between what we're discussing and what a wet encampment might look like?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, so you had brought up kind of wet housing or wet shelters that really assist individuals who are utilizing to use in a safe way, whether it's drugs or alcohol. And that in these shelters, we're looking at using in open spaces, and it's kind of a unsaid acceptance that you can do what you want to do within your shelter, and there will be Narcan on site and ways that we might be able to prevent overdoses and help individuals, perhaps needle exchange. I'm just kind of curious where that line is, and if we really thought about maybe embracing the idea that maybe there's a wet site or a couple wet sites where we really do get those barriers as low as possible for people to be able to come in and safely use and be connected to resources.
Madam Chair, indeed, these would be wet sites. And again, the emphasis is on behavior management rather than drug or alcohol use management, because we would be in fixed sites. Caseworkers from Southwest Care, for example, who currently do an amazing job with needle exchange and harm reduction work, as just one shout out to a great community partner, or our MIHO team that does some similar work, would know where to find their clients and be able to continue to support them with harm reduction, education, information, materials. So I hope that answers your question. I will say too, wraparound services are the absolute gold standard. We don't have enough wraparound services in the state of New Mexico or in the city of Santa Fe. So I will say too, if we wait for the perfect, that can be the enemy of the good. And I think if we can consolidate what we do have and concentrate them in a few locations, that would be, you know, what we're looking at. In these encampments, we'd have no open use, but there would be use allowed. Nobody's going to be checking inside people's tents, basically. So if people are using in tents, that's what they're doing, and their behavior is within you know, the guidelines set out, then that's what works. And I think we have to have a constant process of quality improvement, check-ins with the community. And it's really an attempt to consolidate existing resources, which are not enough, and you know, not continue to just sort of kick the can down the road with our previous encampment policy, which was a huge resource drain at a $3.4 million annual cost versus the budget Anna laid out for a short-term solution. You can see that there's quite a difference there already. So that's the thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing up that 3.4 million, because I did want to call that number out again, that's an annual number, correct?
Correct.
A lot of money.
And I will say too, I'm sorry, I don't want to take too much time. You know, Coffee with a Cop, go to Coffee with a Cop sometime. Our police officers, and I've done ride-alongs, I'm sure many of you have, where our officers, sometimes detective level officers, are spending an entire day following one unsheltered person down Cerrillos Road. So our police officers are saying, please help us solve homelessness, because that's not what we want to do with our time. That's not an effective use of our public safety services. So, you know, beyond financial, I think our expertise in that field is misdirected, and we need to figure out other ideas and other solutions for that as well. But I told myself I wouldn't get on a soapbox tonight, so I'm going to get off that soapbox, but thank you.
Well, I do think that you make a really valid point about, you know, it's both a better use of resources and better ability to serve the individuals who we need to serve. And so, but it will not be perfect. And I think that we all need to have that really honest conversation right now, that there will be problems, that there is no perfect solution here. This is a really quite a complex issue. It is one that we face in Santa Fe, but one that we are also facing across the nation. I'm actually here in San Diego right now. Welcome to Zoom world, where we get to take city council meetings from far away, which is actually where I did a lot of the bulk of my work with the homeless population, was here in San Diego. And I've seen an increase here as well. And this is a community that has really been struggling with this for a long time, and has a lot of, has done a lot of hard work, and has put in a lot of resources to working with the homeless population here. And just driving around the city, I'm seeing that they are also really, really struggling with this right now. And so I think that discussion, that there just simply are not enough resources, and how we can consolidate them and use the ones that we have as effectively as possible, and work to build that system, work to build that housing pipeline. How we, you know, as Councilor Michael Garcia mentioned, is how we, you know, lend that helping hand to lift people up, is really important. You might not have the answers to this yet. I know this is still something that we're working on. In terms of that looking at behavior as opposed to drug use, and how that kind of becomes the line as to whether or not somebody can be in one of these sanctioned areas, sanctioned encampments. If somebody's behavior is out of line, what would then be the process for where they would go? I mean, are they simply kicked out and then they're, you know, kind of in the public, and then we're dealing with them in the public sphere again? Or is that where law enforcement comes in? How do we balance out that challenge?
Madam Chair, I think it depends on the behavior and how, if it's illegal behavior, then law enforcement would of course be involved. If it's not, then yes, I think they would be asked to leave and basically trespassed, as folks are sometimes from our interfaith shelter, and they'd be, you know, back into the public sphere again.
Thank you, Director Choi. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's going to be one of our larger conversations that we're going to have to work with, which brings me to my next conversation about, or next question about, we're discussing, you know, where would these sites be? And as we have seen with some of our current shelters, that the spillover from the shelters can create challenges for the surrounding neighborhoods. We have had a lot of discussions around Harrison, and how there's really been an increased focus on Harrison. And the report that I've now heard from other places is that ever since we've really done a lot of work on Harrison, which we very much needed to do, and it's really important that that is happening, that they have seen an increase in activity, you know, at the Rail Yard Park or at some other locations. And so again, I think this is going to be part of a larger conversation, how we put this plan together. But when we are looking at the specific sites that are chosen, what the strategy is for those areas directly surrounding it, and how we can mitigate some of the behaviors that might occur. And we've known with interfaith that it's frequently, you know, it may not necessarily be the people that are staying in the shelter, but there might be increased activity that starts to occur around the shelter, whether it's increased drug sales or other behaviors that are happening. So I don't know if you have initial thoughts for this, and I know that this will be part of those larger conversations, and perhaps where those neighborhood ambassador associations, it sounds like those would really come into play there. But if you have any thoughts or comments on initially how we're going to approach that, I would love to hear them at this time.
Madam Chair, we have been working very hard on our security contracts for the city, and that's one area that we will be releasing an RFP for security citywide out of the Community Health and Safety Department. So we would hope to put more resources into private security. You know, I think naturally, when possible, I see our police team is on here. If calls for service allowing, you know, we might have more close patrols around these areas if possible. But, you know, it is going to be a challenge. And I think, you know, part of it is just that it's a challenge now, how being able to, the people who are in these places will really be invested in making sure that they work well and that they are places that can continue to exist. And so I think that's an intrinsic motivation for the folks in the encampment to hopefully not, you know, allow and have a lot of interaction with people who aren't behaving in a way that allows that encampment to sustain as well. But it's going to be a work in progress for sure. I don't think there's any easy answer. We have to bring in all the resources that we can. And again, be willing to assess as we go and, you know, and course correct if we need to course correct if we go forward with it.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ochoa. I appreciate that. I think that is key, that as you mentioned, you know, this will not, and as I mentioned, this will not be perfect. And I do believe this is crucial. This is a really huge challenge for our entire community, those that are experiencing homelessness, as well as those that are experiencing the impact of people experiencing homelessness and how we really work towards this. So I look forward to these further conversations. And as we move forward with this program, I think that this is the direction that we do need to go. And again, I thank you all for your work. I know that this is hard and complex, and that is going to take continued attention and assessment and time and energy, but also hopefully that as we come up with some of these other strategies, there's a lot of energy that, you know, is not just money, but energy and thought going towards chasing and sweeping encampments across the city, and freeing up some of that mental energy from you all to start working on those longer term solutions. I think is important too. And I think that that's something that we also should recognize is this takes up a lot of time throughout the city, and freeing that up for you guys does allow us to be thinking of other creative solutions that maybe will be more long-term, or how we build upon this. So thank you all so much for being here. And I'm sure we'll be picking this up again at future Quality of Life Committee meetings as well. And with that, let's go ahead and move to our next presentation. We have a Midtown progress report. The administrative review draft plan and code presentation by Strategic Economics and Opticos Design, the Midtown Redevelopment Land Economics and Urban Planning Partners. Rich Brown is here, Daniel Hernandez is here, Opticos is here, Dean is here. We have a lot of people we haven't seen in a while, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Rich, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening to everyone on the council. Thank you for allowing us this time. I'm just going to take a couple minutes. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hernandez, the Midtown project manager, to give you some color around what we're going to talk about tonight. But I wanted to state that we are now post the resolution that was recently passed in this moving forward phase of our process. And we talk, and Daniel had in many of his presentations, about the interconnecting of the development framework with the community development framework, or the community development plan. And just recently, we had a presentation here with our impact report on community development. And now you're going to start to see more iterations of the land development plan and the zoning plan. So this is a first of many presentations you'll have in the progress report as it relates to land development, and then the starting of the alignment of the community development wants and needs to how it works in land development planning. So with that, Daniel probably can explain a little bit more, but I wanted to just let everyone know that this is the first in a new series as we move forward with that resolution going forward in Midtown development. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hernandez, and he'll introduce the team and do the presentation from there.
Thank you, Rich. Good evening, committee. So today is just introducing the plan. This is the first time that in a while that we've been, that we'll be rolling out the plan over the course of summer, but we wanted to start with the committees before we started doing much more public engagement. And we hope to collaborate with the Midtown engagement partners over the course of spring and summer to vet and get input on the Midtown plan. So this is the land development plan. And if you can remember, I described the community development plan as a policy making plan that how we implement development. So we know a physical structure that can get built on the site, but what's inside of it, what kinds of hiring goals, job goals, affordability goals do we want to have? Those are not embedded in the actual structure, it's in policy. So those are the two plans that we're working on simultaneously over the course of spring and summer. But tonight, again, we're introducing to you a preliminary view of the plan. And again, it will unfold and get refined over the course of summer. The other thing, I want to turn it over quickly to Stefan so we can begin the presentation, but I want to remind the committee, if they haven't seen any announcements or heard on the radio already, the Midtown Engagement Partners are hosting a Voices at Midtown event. It'll be a Zoom event. And I believe the press releases went out today from the city. But if you haven't received them, we'll make sure that you get them so that you can participate. But again, it is introducing the concepts and their findings of their report. Again, they want additional community input before they wrap up the report at the end of this month. And that report will be, it will help inform the community development plan as we move forward. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Stefan to introduce the plan. And I believe you have share capacity rights, whatever. So share your screen, Stefan. Is that right?
Sure thing. Thanks, Daniel. I can go ahead and get that started. Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the governing body. Thanks for the introduction. Stefan Pellegrini, principal at Opticos Design, and very happy to be with you here tonight. In just one moment, I will share my screen.
Daniel, while he's doing that, maybe you can introduce Dina Belzer also.
Oh, yes. So Dina Belzer is with us. She's the head of strategic economics. And they are also working on the land economics, the valuation of land, as well as the financing structure, which that will begin to unfold next month as well. She's working closely with the finance department to put presentations together for next month. So you'll begin seeing more and more presentations on this idea of return on investment, as well as how we will determine land values over the course of the development of Midtown. So Dina, you might want to wave, say hi.
Hi, everybody. I'm really here to answer any questions about implementation as they come up after Stefan's presentation.
Great. And I also want to add, Madam Chair, if I could, I don't know if I've officially done it, but Lee Loxton has come on board as our new asset development manager for Midtown. And he will be driving our rezoning effort. It's the very important element of redevelopment is the rezoning effort. So as we move forward in this iteration of plans, Mr. Logston will be presenting some of the steps moving forward for that standpoint. But I want to officially welcome Lee to the team on our committee. So with that, Stefan, you're ready? We're ready to go.
Sure thing. Just one moment, and apologies for the technical difficulties on my end.
Stefan, would it be easier if Dina put it up?
That actually might be faster. Joining my screen right now. Let's see if this will work.
Okay, hang on one second.
Well, while we're all waiting, I wanted to say to Madam Chair, we're both in California. I'm on the northern end and Madam Chair's on the southern end. And so my background is what the northern end of the state of California looks like. It's super rocky. There are beaches, but not as nice and temperate as they are in San Diego. And Mr. Hernandez is in the middle of the state. So we got California covered for tonight's quality of life meeting.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina, for bringing up the presentation, and my apologies for that.
Absolutely. Can everybody see it?
Yeah.
Great.
Technical difficulties. So what we have tonight is actually about a 20-minute presentation. We're going to provide an introduction to the land development plan, and then provide plenty of opportunities for questions and discussion. So I'm happy to bring this to you this evening. Dina, can you go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So I'm going to start by introducing the plan and providing a little bit of information about the objectives for Midtown that are articulated in the plan and are reflective of much of the input that we've received to date. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the structure and organization of the plan. I'm going to start sort of at the big picture, 30,000 foot level, and then I'll spend some time talking about some of the information that each of the respective chapters includes before concluding for questions and discussion. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the objectives for Midtown, and go to the next slide, Dina. So as I mentioned, many of the objectives that are articulated in the plan have come from both the sort of more recent community-oriented process, but also sort of the great history of planning at Midtown that's occurred over the course of many years to date. The plan outlines goals to provide a new center for Santa Fe, and I will talk a bit more about that in the next few slides. Information about providing multiple and different kinds of spaces and opportunities for public gathering. Goals around connectivity and enhancing connections between this portion of the city and adjacent neighborhoods and other parts of the region. Objectives around job generation, affordable housing, and sustainability. And I'll break down each one of these a little bit further. With regards to this idea of a center, first and foremost, we have a series of really wonderful community buildings that exist at Midtown today and have the opportunity to become anchors for future development at the Midtown site. These include the library, the Garson Theater, SFAI, to mention just a few. And we're thinking about these as anchors and anchoring these along a network of interconnected open spaces that will also orient to and connect to a main plaza space at sort of the heart of Midtown. And this area is sort of being conceptualized as a space that mixed-use buildings can line with shopfront spaces and opportunities to enliven the pedestrian realm. And thinking about this really sort of as a core where the most intense development and activities at Midtown can be focused. So that development at Midtown actually can follow their tradition of how we sort of think about places and communities in New Mexico oriented around central plaza spaces. With regards to green spaces, there's sort of our diversity of open spaces that are planned to support a variety of activities. These include sort of both small, medium, and large spaces. I mentioned the Central Plaza as a space for gathering and performances. There is sort of a large linear park or Alameda that's being conceptualized along the eastern portion of Midtown that would be appropriate sort of for walking, jogging, and enhanced wildlife habitat, as well as a number of sort of pocket parks and plazas where more intimate activities like playgrounds, gardens, and sort of public art can occur. The idea is that all of these can be connected to one another through a network of pedestrian paseos and bike routes, and that these can also be oriented to sort of the other civic and public uses that we'll have at Midtown. We're also looking at ways to connect to significant open spaces that are adjacent and in the vicinity of Midtown. Most importantly, the Franklin Miles Park ball fields to the west. There's also been an opportunity to discuss active spaces, including the opportunity for potentially a powwow arena that can also be located on site. And we've had good discussions about that opportunity and believe that sort of the civic space framework could accommodate such a use if it has the opportunity to land at Midtown. I mentioned this issue around connectivity. This is happening sort of on many levels. The plan identifies connections between Midtown and adjacent neighborhoods, particularly via stronger bicycle and pedestrian connections. And so, for example, we're thinking about ways to better connect the Hopewell Man neighborhood to the east and northeast, especially to provide access to the new community anchors that will occur on the Midtown site, for example, the library. It's also important to sort of think about how to connect strong north-south and east-west bike and ped connections so that we can ensure that Midtown is connected within the region and to stitch this area together to other districts. This has to do with sort of connecting to other bike and ped amenities within this portion of Santa Fe. It also is a way to think about sort of getting pedestrians and bicyclists from the Midtown site to transit connections that are immediately adjacent such as the bus lines along Cerritos. I mentioned this goal of job generation, and so we're sort of thinking about Midtown as an opportunity for mixed-use development. The central spine that actually sort of has the plaza at its center that you can see here organized in the orange. This could potentially be a place for future employment and commercial uses mixed with residential and live-work opportunities. We're also thinking about the southern portion of the site, the existing Garson Film Studio complex, in ways that can be enhanced with new uses and new opportunities for job generation, intensification of the film industry and how it's using that part of the site, potentially with office uses that can support the studio uses, and then sort of ground floor retail and sort of other opportunities around the plaza, which can also provide an opportunity for jobs. And then with regards to affordable housing, we understand this sort of is a key opportunity, and we'll be talking about this a little bit more this evening. But as Daniel mentioned, we're thinking about the land development plan primarily as sort of a regulatory framework. So we're thinking about a zoning code here that can allow and accommodate a variety of housing types that can make both sort of affordable and attainable housing achievable in this part of the city. Affordable housing has an opportunity to be supported by inclusionary zoning and also the opportunities around the city being able to sell land at discounted rates to enable affordable housing projects. So we're looking at that as an implementation strategy, and we're also looking at ways that affordable housing can be included in the early phases of development and outlined in the plan. And then finally, with regards to sustainability, we're using the LEED neighborhood development as a framework to guide choices around sustainability within the plan and for future development. And that's sort of an important way to sort of think about both the infrastructure and what can be done sort of on the public framework side, but also sort of what we can ask future development on the private side to attempt to achieve in order to ensure sustainability in new buildings and new construction. On the public side, you know, one of the things that we're really looking at is stormwater management. We know that the site today doesn't really have a comprehensive stormwater strategy, and so that will be an important public framework and component to sort of bring to the site. There's an opportunity to integrate that with sort of the connectivity framework and the open space framework so that public spaces have that built in. We're also sort of thinking about ways to optimize and maximize multimodal transportation options along the site. That means connecting to existing transit opportunities, such as the rail runner and the bus system, but also making sure that low carbon transport is an attractive option. And that means bringing sort of a high quality pedestrian and bicycle network to the site to ensure that those trips are attractive and easy. And then we also have opportunities to think about sustainable energy infrastructure. Many of you may know that there is an existing gas infrastructure system on the campus. There's an opportunity to discontinue that and shift toward, all electric energy, which can absolutely be more sustainable over the long term. So now I'm going to pivot and talk a little bit about the structure and the organization of this land development plan. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the points that Daniel mentioned about how we think about the land development plan in the context of the other planning work that we're doing for the Midtown campus. So Daniel mentioned that the community development plan is really the policy framework for the plan. So with the land development plan, what we're really primarily thinking about is making the physical container. We're thinking about the spaces and the buildings, the streets, the different physical components that we can actually articulate that can become the container for the different policies that can be implemented through the community development plan. So we're thinking about policies and priorities for future development, and we're thinking about this both as a regulatory and a policy document. We want to think about the sort of standards, development standards, things that we can do with regards to the zoning that can enable this future container. And that we also sort of want to think about this as something that's going to require participation of multiple development partners. That means that there are public framework components that, excuse me, the city or others may invest in. There are private developers, a variety of private developers that actually may be participating in the development of this site in the future. And we want to make sure that the regulatory framework is sort of allowing and enabling that participation. So we're thinking about the development standards as a way to implement the vision for development over the long term. And this is primarily sort of focused on the physical form and character that we're trying to make at the site. So the land development plan is currently organized in 8 chapters. There are 4 chapters that actually describe the vision and context of the site. And there are 4 chapters that actually focus on the standards and the implementing framework, the stuff that actually sort of makes the skeleton that actually makes development at the site actually achievable. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about sort of each of these to give you a sense of what's included in each of the chapters. So starting with the vision chapters, there are 4 of those. We start with a mission statement, which provides sort of an introduction to the plan and provides sort of the primary mission for development at Midtown. There's a background and setting chapter, which provides a history of the planning process to date, and also provides an opportunity to think about the site analytically and understand its key opportunities and constraints for development. There's a chapter that describes the physical vision for the site, and there's a chapter that focuses on connectivity and mobility, particularly with this emphasis for this multimodal connectivity, new pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, enhanced connections to transit. And these are some sample spreads from the plan that give you a sense of sort of the more detailed components that each of the chapters include. So chapter 1 includes a mission and vision statement, provides information around what the purpose of this land development plan is and its focus and organization. It sort of grounds this plan in the existing plan and policy framework that the city has and its relationship to other plans. And it outlines the key goals for development in Midtown that of course have been developed over many years and really centralized around this 4-part framework that we've had an opportunity to discuss many times around equity, economy, culture, and the environment. Chapter 2, as I mentioned, provides the background and setting. This provides some information on the regional relevance of the site, key demographics in Santa Fe and in the adjacent neighborhoods to Midtown. It talks about some of the key site conditions, constraints, and opportunities that can be overcome through new development on the site. And it provides some key background information with regards to urban form and the public realm that really sort of grounds these ideas about what we're trying to make here with regards to this physical container. Chapter 3 provides key information about the vision. This provides information about connectivity and mobility, about the open space and stormwater network, as well as this network of civic and open spaces that I mentioned previously. There's additional information guiding urban form and building scale here, as well as content around placemaking, how we sort of envision the development of the site occurring over time through a series of phases, and what sort of development program actually might be achievable here, as well as some specific information around how development can reinforce community health through livability and other attainable goals. And then, as I mentioned, there's a key chapter on connectivity and mobility. This provides information with regards to how we can make key connections between the site and the surrounding area through policy, and also how we can sort of ground decisions that we make about an interconnected network of streets, blocks, pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure on the Midtown site itself. So we're providing opportunities to think about both external connectivity as well as internal connectivity on the site. And then Chapter 5 outlines information on infrastructure and public facilities. This is primarily focused on what's happening underground, as well as sort of important infrastructure above ground. For example, it provides a plan for stormwater and water quality management on the site, as well as establishing sort of policies for how what happens on the site can connect to the surrounding area. And it provides guidance for how this actually can be incorporated into the public infrastructure on the site. The infrastructure chapter also provides information for other kinds of utilities and sets forth both sort of the location of those utilities and the extent of those utilities that would be necessary to accommodate and support new development at the site in the future. And then getting into sort of the end of the plan, we focus on, again, sort of the development standards and regulations that are seeking to guide new private development on the site. So with development standards, we're thinking about both sort of the public framework as well as sort of what would guide sort of the development of future private parcels. So when thinking about the public framework, there's guidance for how we can make streets and civic and open spaces and places that are within the public realm. There's also guidance for how we actually can establish development standards that would guide buildings. And this is designed to actually supplement the standards that occur today within the Midtown link and provide sort of a greater level of specificity for what can happen in different portions of the site to ensure really sort of high quality development can occur. There's an emphasis in all parts of this on the parts of the development that actually have to do with the public realm. So we're thinking about how buildings interface with streets and public right-of-ways. We're thinking about their frontage in terms of sort of the interstitial space between the back of the building, the front of the building and the back of the sidewalk, for example, and those pieces that actually we publicly engage with. We're also thinking about how we can sort of organize buildings of different intensity on different locations within the site, and how it can also provide further clarity about where different land uses might actually be appropriate. Thinking about this idea of a more intense mixed-use core versus establishing other residential neighborhoods around that core that can support some of the public and institutional framework that I described earlier. So the idea is that future development, future private developers have an opportunity to look specifically at this chapter and understand the expectations for physical development that are being set for any given person. And then lastly, the plan will provide some information around administration, implementation, and financing. We've been working closely with Dina and Daniel to develop the content for this chapter. The idea is that this actually will provide an implementation framework for providing sort of key policy and actionable steps that can be followed to implement the plan. But we also sort of want to think about this context in some of the sort of thinking about some of the primary mechanisms to do that. And we have an opportunity to sort of talk about that more in depth with Dina and Daniel this evening. So that sort of concludes my introduction to the plan, and I sort of welcome your any questions and discussion you may have around this today, and look forward to discussing this more in depth with you in the coming months as we get closer to a public review draft of the plan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here for the presentation, and it's exciting to hear about the progress that's been being made in this area. I will open it up to members of the committee for questions. Councilwoman Villarreal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'm just curious overall, who's the audience for this plan draft?
That's an excellent question. we really need to think about this plan being accessible to everyone in terms of this is absolutely a plan that staff needs to be able to use over many years to implement the plan, but it also needs to be something that the community can pick up and understand and use to advocate for what happens at the site in the future. As I mentioned, the focus is really on that physical container, and this needs to basically sort of work closely with the community development plan that has an opportunity to prioritize the policy that can actually support that physical container. But it's absolutely important that those two work hand in hand, that those are both accessible and both sort of highly readable and legible by all members of the community.
Yeah, I think as a former community planner who's gone through formal training, this makes sense to me because I've been exposed to it. But the average audience, which is the public, there's a lot of planning jargon that I would suggest that you not use to make it as simple as possible. And if there's terms you use, to try to define them somewhere in maybe footnotes, just because I want this to be accessible so people understand kind of this vision and different aspects as it relates to land development. And that's already a tough topic in general for people to digest. So I think some people would really be jazzed about the way this is structured right now, and others would be like, what is this? Doesn't make sense. So I think just trying to get rid of jargon or be clear about what the audience, if this is just the overarching understanding of the land development plan, or if this is like for developers as they potentially look at the becoming a partner in Midtown. And then also obviously staff we'd want that accessible, which I think it is for our planners. And then there's a part you talked about at the beginning that talked about selling land at discounted rates. Let's see, it's at the beginning as it relates to housing affordability. And did you all, or have you all been considering or looking at not just discounted rates, but donating land so that we actually get affordable workforce housing development? Because as we know, the only way that not just number wise it works out, but just the way how expensive it is to develop in Santa Fe, that it works well when there's ways that we can prioritize land and donate it for affordable options. So are you all considering that possibility?
Dina, do you want to take it and I can follow up?
Yeah, that's a great question, Counselor. The answer is yes. So the work that I'm doing with my colleague, Sarah Woodworth, where we're looking at this return on investment modeling. We have a land economics model that covers the entire site. And then we can look at a continuum of valuations to understand how much return on investment the city might get from land sales. And that can represent a range. And this is very much a policy choice. As Daniel said earlier, there's the policy part of the plan, and then there's the regulatory part of the plan. We're actually looking at the regulatory part of the plan today, as Stefan said, the vessels. So the decisions around the price for land, when that decision will be made, all of that will be part of the policy document. We just want to be sure that we know how many units we can generate. We want to know if there's a good connection between the infrastructure. We want to be sure we have the right infrastructure. We want to be sure we have the right stormwater system. So all of those things need to be in place in order to build anything affordable or not. So the answer, that's a long answer, but that's what we've been talking to the Midtown engagement partners about too, is can you see yourselves and your needs and wants in this? Do you understand where you can fit? And as they're saying yes or no, we're then adjusting so that we can be sure that whatever it is people think they need and want in the future will be able to be accommodated within this regulatory framework. So, so again, we're looking at a range of densities. We've talked to several affordable housing developers. We know the community is very interested in a community land trust model. And any or all of those things could be accommodated, again, at a range of densities based on what is already being built by affordable housing developers in Santa Fe.
Thank you, Dina. Are you also looking at, when you're talking about return on investment? Because to me, investment's also like community access.
Exactly. Yes.
But yes. I guess I'm thinking more like, in order to make affordable housing possible, are there other elements that are not in the housing realm, like the retail side of things, or the there's other uses that you're talking about, the studios, office space, retail, et cetera? If there's ways that that would be a return on investment in order for us to actually then prioritize affordable housing. Maybe you don't have the answer, but maybe when we get to that financial analysis, I would like to see how things, I know it's more complicated than the way I'm making it sound, but I'm just curious if there's ways that we invest in different aspects of the project and community development part, but then it offsets what we're trying to do in terms of livability, affordability of housing. And, you know, that's a whole spectrum, but obviously I'm looking at like workforce housing, transitional housing, all of the spectrums of like precariously housed folks, as I had said earlier in another meeting. So just curious if that's a possibility for the next kind of analysis and presentation that we get.
Madam Chair and Councilor Villarreal, I just want to explore that question you had. I think you're right, we will be exploring that, but I wanted to know whether you're looking at the commercial spaces as maybe co-ops or something of that nature to provide profit and purpose at the same time as it goes into development. Is that why you're asking the question?
I mean, that's a possibility, but I guess I'm thinking about ways that we allow for certain developments in order to get something else.
Yes. Yes. So the model that we're creating is fairly fluid in that, you know, I'm exaggerating the point, but you know, donating a site and then the other commercial site is going to generate higher levels of income because we are going to do something else that has a higher rate of return. And those are the balances that will continually have, that, you know, the city will have to contend with as they sell property over time. But the model right now is just sort of setting a base, like this is what we can expect. And it includes housing affordability. It includes, you know, some commercial space like the arts, you know, the arts hub that may have some affordability within that. The library is not going to be an income generator. So all of those things play out in this model. So policy decisions can continue to be made into the future, but we're just going to set kind of a base right now so that we have something that we can present to the public about what levels of returns we might expect and when we can reduce our operating expenses over a period of time as well on the site, including the repayment of the bond.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add to that also is that we have decoupled the cost of infrastructure from the cost of land development, which is another way of achieving the goal that you're talking about. And we're working on understanding our infrastructure costs and looking at a variety of ways to pay for that, for any infrastructure upgrades that could not necessarily be tied to land sales. So I think this is, on the one hand, what you're saying, what Daniel's pointing out is you could use land sales to cross-subsidize, but you could also use those land sales to pay for the infrastructure, which then also becomes a subsidy. So I think that there's a lot of complexity and detail there. And as Daniel said, the model will be modular, and we're working very closely with Mary McCoy and Brad in the finance department, because there will be a series of ways to look at this over time. And we're doing now a detailed infrastructure assessment. We'll start in early April so that we know what those costs are. They won't be black box. And so I think that's one of the ways in which this master plan, if you will, is different from if you had a master developer who would automatically be expected to carry all those infrastructure costs within the structure of their land sales. And we're decoupling those and really trying to look at them in parallel, but not assuming that we're going to burden all the land.
Thank you for
So
that.
that's another way to think about it.
Yes, I appreciate that. And I guess I'm hoping that these scenarios, if they are scenarios that you give us when we talk about the financial aspect and the levels of return, quote, levels of return, that I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong, but there may be an actual scenario where we don't break even, that we are still subsidizing.
That's
that
right.
we will still be putting money into this property. I mean,
Yes.
that's kind of a reality, I guess.
Right.
I guess I don't want people, my colleagues, to assume that we're just going to be like, all right, we're done with it. No more costs for the city of Santa Fe. That's not going to happen. If we want what we want in terms of affordability, community spaces, et cetera.
Right.
So I'm just putting that out there and look forward to that conversation as we get to that.
I think that's right. I want to say two additional things. One is that you won't see this financial analysis until probably over the summer, partly because it's going to take us a while to get these infrastructure costs. So just to set everybody's expectations, we have the models built. We're ready to go. We're just waiting for those costs. And then we're going to have to make decisions about phasing. But also sort of to another point that I thought you might be making, but maybe you weren't. So I'm going to suggest this, which is that there is return that's being created for the city that is above and beyond the monetary return that comes from selling land. And I think this is a little bit where you're going too, is there's the benefit of creating affordable housing across a wider spectrum of income eligibility. But we also have an amazing opportunity to create a bunch of really exciting community facilities here. That if the city had to go out and build a new main library with anything like the architectural character of the Fogelson Library, it would cost more than the city, more than all of the capital costs in the city has invested in the site today. So that's also how we're looking at this. The Visual Arts Center, same thing. The Garson Theater, those will be community facilities that the community would not, that the city would not have the opportunity to provide without having invested in Midtown. So it's kind of, I keep using the Antiques Roadshow analogy. If you've gone to an auction and you've bought a box and, did you pay back what you paid for the auction? And then the answer is yes, depending on how you look at the value of each individual object that was in the box. So we're going to look at it both ways. Because I know that a lot of people across the governing body have a variety of questions and concerns about this, and we're wanting to address all of those.
Thank you, Dina. You hit the mark. That was what I was trying to get at, and that's music to
very,
ears.
It's a great way to try to think about it. And again, there's no one right answer. And so we're trying to really bracket the range of people's concerns and interests in this, what we're calling return on investment analysis.
Great.
And I'm sorry we don't have more to show, but we'll start rolling information out with the Finance Committee, as Daniel said, probably in April, May-ish. That'll be a start to understanding how do we get to land values. Like there's just a lot packed into that very basic assumption. How do we think about return on investment? Just what I said, is it, did we buy the box and then get back the value of the box plus, or are we getting back, are we just, how do we calculate that?
Great. Thanks, Dina. I appreciate that. And then the last question I had was, as it relates to, I think Stefan said something about we need to create a regulatory framework for private developers and opportunities. Can you say more about that? What you mean by that?
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the anticipation is that we're going to be making parcels at Midtown that will be made available to different developers. And those parcels will then need guidance about how we can actually put development on those sites with regards to how we orient buildings, their frontage, how parking works, things like that. And the Midtown Link provides a good sort of basis for thinking about how development should happen at the site, but it's not as specific enough as is needed to really implement something that is sort of in keeping with the community's vision. And so the idea is to sort of supplement what's in the Midtown Link with some additional development standards that can ensure that we have this sort of high quality public realm that emerges at Midtown.
Thank you. And when you're saying development standards, are they going to be different than what we have currently for our land use code? And as you mentioned, Midtown Link, because we were just talking about this in the Community Development Commission meeting earlier, and how it hasn't been actually utilized yet, the Midtown Link. And that's a disappointment because we really thought that there were some good components there, but no developers have taken on that, taken the lead to be able to utilize that. So I'm curious, when you say development standards, are you talking about ones that are specific to Midtown, or?
Yeah, maybe sort of I can sort of provide sort of a couple of examples. One is that the Midtown Link provides what's essentially sort of a height bonus from the existing zoning, and it allows, I think in most of the Midtown district, you can go up to 35 feet right now, and then the link basically says you can go up to 52. On the Midtown site itself, the link says you can go up to 62. But it doesn't say anything about what that means and sort of where and how you should think about like an increase in height. So we could basically say, well, maybe along streets, you could go up to 62 feet. Maybe there are spaces within Midtown that actually are pedestrian-oriented paseos where you can set a height standard that actually ensures more of sort of a human scale. And you could sort of think about that in relationship to some of the sort of tighter spaces that you might have in downtown Santa Fe and your experience as a pedestrian and the scale of buildings that you have there. Another way to think about it is that the Midtown Link provides some guidance for relief around things like lot coverage or open space, required open space on site. And so in principle, it basically says, well, in the zone, you might need to set aside some open space, but we're going to be sort of silent on how you do that. And what we can do with these supplemental standards is say, you could take your open space requirement and actually express it in spaces that we know will be beneficial to the residents and to the community, things like courtyards or terraces or sort of other spaces that we can sort of take those standards and form them into a physical thing that again provides sort of more specificity than the Midtown Link standards actually provide.
So we'll possibly build upon what we already have, but it won't have its own development standards on the Midtown property. Is that correct? We'll have separate, I guess I'm just curious if it connects with our current development standards, or if we're kind of having a different, more flexibility, or I don't know.
It will. We absolutely sort of want to think about this as a way to implement with further specificity the standards that we already have, as opposed to thinking about, let's do something completely different here. We're sort of trying to sort of hone in on a more detailed vision for the site.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for your work, and I look forward to the next presentations that we have. Take care.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilor Lee Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a quick question, I guess, in regards to what is the foresight of how big of a property is the Midtown area, and how much is projected to be retained by the city, and how much is possibly going to be either sold, gifted, utilized for that type of return. And so going back to the dialogue previously in regards to what creates an asset to our community, and definitely is the ability for us to utilize it, have it accessible to our citizens. At the same time, how, what percentage of it might be utilized for sale. I think somebody talked about mixed use developments, and all this is going to go into the different zoning that is assigned, I believe, to this piece of property. So I think I'll stop there. If somebody wants to tackle that, please.
I can get that started, and it's a little bit difficult for me to sort of talk about concrete numbers right now, only because I don't have them in front of me. But maybe just sort of try to characterize this. The site is about 65 acres in size. And the idea is that in order to open that up for development, we need to create a framework of streets and civic spaces and open spaces to make those parcels available for development. And so the streets and the sort of that public framework in concept is public. It should be the piece of the site that actually moves forward sort of in the public realm. And then on top of that, we have this framework of buildings on the campus today that have an opportunity either to continue to be public amenities or sort of reopen and be made available to the public. So an example of the former would be like SFAI or the Garson Theater. An example of the latter would be the Fulgelson Library, which is not a public amenity right now, but there's an opportunity to sort of make it so, and open sort of a public facility there. So we sort of have that sort of piece as well. And we're sort of thinking about those pieces as the primary public framework, the public infrastructure for the site. There's also an opportunity I mentioned to make much better connections to stuff that is there today, which is really not accessible. And so an example of that would be the General Franklin Miles Park, which it's, I think, 28 acres in size. It is a really wonderful amenity, but you cannot get to it right now directly from the Midtown site. There's no way to actually establish a direct connection. But as we think about people living and working on Midtown, it would be an excellent policy priority to actually make that connection to that park and to basically open up that existing public amenity just to be directly accessible. You think about sort of how people could actually walk directly just a few blocks to that site, but today it's just not possible. And so in the future, there could be sort of policies that are identified that actually could make that kind of connection achievable.
I can add a little bit more detail if you want. About 2/3 of the land, based on the diagram that Stefan showed earlier, and this is subject to change, so this is just a preliminary number. But based on our preliminary numbers now, about 64% of the land would be available for sale. The price is to be determined. We just discussed that. About 20% of the land would be either sold or leased as these community anchor buildings. So some of those buildings could be sold to other organizations. They don't all need to be retained by the city. About 17% of the land would be dedicated to public infrastructure. So that would include the plaza, the streets, some of the paseos will be on private property. So that's roughly how it's breaking down to sort of today, and that could change. Again, we're just in the early phases.
Thank you. So, I mean, that answers my question very well. And when you're taking a look at housing and the availability of utilizing this property for that, that takes a big part of the usable property. and gives it life, for one. How do you create the densities that you need? And I think that will only probably go with height, and I think we just touched on that as well. So those are just a couple of my comments, and you know, I think the community is really interested in seeing how this works out. You probably can't get to a start date or an implementation date because you know, and that just takes time. So I appreciate the presentation and all the hard work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Counselor. Counselor Michael Garcia and Counselor Lee Garcia, if you can please take your hand down. Thank you. Counselor Michael Garcia, floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess I just got a quick, simple question. Is this presentation going to be given to the governing body?
Actually, Rich, yes, but it'll be
Sorry.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, it will be. And but usually we try to condense it. We know that your agendas are so full, so we try to get it into much more compact form for you.
Okay. And then I guess the follow-up to that is I think I heard you say you were going to give a separate presentation later on this summer around the fiscal components to the finance committee. So with that being said, is that presentation going to be given to the governing body? Because I don't like the piecemealing of this. I think this is critical information that we all need to have. You know, and if that means us working with the city manager to develop our governing body agendas accordingly, so you can give an appropriate presentation, I think that that's going to benefit us all. Because there might be, you know, whenever the presentation is given at finance, I might not be available, which means I got to get the condensed version at governing body. And with such an important project, I don't like the condensed methodology. Let's give it all to us all at once. So that's just a comment, I guess, Madam Chair. Thank you for clarifying, Daniel. I appreciate it. No other questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Daniel, and thank you, everybody else that helped with this, Dina, and et cetera.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Counselor. Any other questions or comments from the committee? None? Well, thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you so much for the presentation and for the work. Very much looking forward to this continued discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Thank you, committee.
Okay, moving on.
Thank you, team.
Thank you. Moving on, let's go to items pulled from consent. Item A, this item was pulled by Lee Garcia. This is a request for approval of fiscal year 22 supplemental police vehicle purchase for the vehicles, equipment, and labor costs associated with each vehicle in the total amount of approximately $2.9 million. Funding and budget adjustment resolution was approved at the March 9th, 2022 governing body meeting. We have Ben Valdez, Deputy Chief of Police, here to present. Councilor Lee Garcia, floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I just have a little bit of a couple of questions in regards to the hybrid units and how are you guys currently utilizing any of the hybrid units in the police pursuit right now?
Madam Chair, Councilor Lee Garcia. Yes, sir. We have 7 hybrid units that we've been utilizing for the past year, and those are the pursuit rated hybrid units.
Okay, and I guess just going towards, you know, hybrid and electric and this is a whole new territory for a lot of us. They've been pretty durable, minimal downtime, less, you know, in the maintenance of them is a little bit less cost for it as well.
Councilor Lee Garcia, so the maintenance is pretty straightforward. It has 2 engines. It has the conventional engine, but then also an Atkinson hybrid electric engine, which reduces the fuel consumption of the vehicle. That Atkinson doesn't require too much maintenance at this point. We've been deploying hybrids in our fleet since approximately 2016. with the Fusion platform. But for the pursuit rated one, that's a new arena for us. It just started back in 2020. We began fielding them in 2021. Today we had a deployment with our vehicles with one of our older naturally aspirated Explorers and our hybrid unit as well. And that hybrid unit had great performance based on the driver that I spoke with during today's critical incident.
Good to hear. Thank you. Sometimes you wonder about, you guys have to get in those vehicles and zoom away pretty quickly. And so they, just dependability wise, maintenance. So these new units are all-wheel drive, the utility models?
Yes, Counselor.
And me coming from the automotive industry, how is the maintenance on the drivetrains with these, especially when you're utilizing, you hear that I'm in the tire business, so if you mess up one tire, you replace all four. These type of things can add to costs. But what type of, what do you guys foresee as far as costs with things of drivetrain and will that affect your budget considerably in the future?
Councilor Lee Garcia, I don't see our maintenance costs going up too much, but I do see us having a significant cost savings in fuel consumption. We've been utilizing all-wheel drive vehicles for a patrol fleet since 2013 with both the sedan and utility versions of the Police Interceptor. And again, just with normal wear and tear that we see with those types of patrol vehicles, they do have a lot of, stress use because they have to be used for emergency response. They're out there, minimum of 4 days, sometimes 7 days a week in the field. So we have seen that they've held up very well. There was one thing that we saw with the Police Interceptor platform that was like a common thing, but it happened just here and there. And it's just a module on the transmission that is a quick swap and then it's back up and running. But in comparison to vehicles we had in the past, we used to have issues with tires where you'd only be able to get maybe 15 to 20,000 miles of them because those vehicles were overloaded. Those were our Impalas. They were not intended for patrol duty use like we use them. Our officers have quite a bit of equipment that they carry in their vehicles. They have upfitted equipment such as a partition to allow transport. The vehicles we're looking for right now with the Police Interceptor, they were built for that type of stress. They are built for that type of performance to be able to manage, the rigors of the police environment and the workload that our officers are going to put them through. All the gear and equipment that they have, the high stress driving where they're having to do rapid acceleration and deceleration. So they come with beefier suspension, beefier brakes, and with the tires that we have, they're also rated to be utilized for that type of police use.
Thank you. One last question I guess I might ask is the batteries in these, how often do you perceive possibly having to change them out? When I think I read somewhere in the packet that when officers may be on idle time, they might be utilizing that battery to power up, all of the equipment that they're suited up with. And so what would you perceive as possibly having to change those out and how often?
Councilor Lee Garcia, that was a question that we had when we first looked at hybrids back in 2016. Of all the vehicles that we've had since 2016, we've had to replace 0 of those lithium-ion batteries. So we're anticipating that lithium-ion battery will last the life of the vehicle, so anywhere from 5 to 7 years. So we're hoping we will not need to replace them. But again, with it being in the patrol field realm with these hybrid vehicles now, we're going to be able to see the full function of it because the other hybrids we had were mostly relegated to administrative duties and such. But I know the Ford Motor Company, they put those batteries through quite a bit of torture testing with extreme heat, cold, even jostling around to see if they can make sure that the durability of the batteries are going to be functional. But with us, this is kind of a new frontier for us in the patrol realm with these vehicles. We know Ford Motor Company has a very good product, and we're hoping that those batteries will last the 5 to 7 service years that we have those vehicles in our fleet. But again, we're going to be evaluating that as we go through because they're being deployed in a patrol function now versus an administrative function like they were before.
Thank you, Chief Valdez, Deputy Chief Valdez. I have no further questions. If anybody has any questions, I can make a motion.
Any other further questions from the committee? And if not, what are the wishes of the committee?
Motion to approve.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Ms. Martin, can I please get a roll call?
Counselor Michael Garcia,
Yes.
Counselor Villarreal,
Yes.
Counselor Garcia, Ali Garcia,
Yes.
Counselor Chavez,
Yes.
Chair Cassette,
Yes.
motion passes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deputy Chief Valdez, for being with us. Moving on to item B. This is consideration of resolution 2022 has not been filled in yet to approve amending impact fees capital improvement plan FY fiscal year 2021 to 2027 and replace tables 80 and 81, listing planned road improvements and parks and trails improvements as recommended by the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee. We have Romela Glorioso Mas here to present. Romela, wonderful to see you. And Councilwoman Villarreal pulled this item. Councilwoman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, staff, for being here. Just a couple of clarity questions. As I think mostly because I had gotten multiple concerns from the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee members. So I'm just trying to circle back with some of those questions that were asked to me, which I couldn't answer. So I think it would be just helpful to clarify some things for the committee members. And maybe you could just start with how priorities were determined and presented to the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee.
Chairwoman and Councilwoman Villarreal, Regina Wheeler, Public Works Director. I've been working closely with Romela and Lee Logston to lead these items through the Capital Improvement Advisory Committee, along with Patricia Fagali, Assistant City Attorney. She's been the City Attorney that has been guiding all of our submittals and as well as giving presentations to the Impact Fee Committee. And so prioritization isn't really what's happening here. What's happening is that all of these projects are equally eligible for funding by the impact fees. And they come from our long-range transportation master plan. They come from our ICIP projects that have been identified as priorities already by the governing body in our capital plans, in our adopted transportation master plans, pedestrian master plans, and bicycle master plans. And so that's mostly where the works on this list comes from. We also explained to the Impact Fee Committee, and I think I've spoken to governing body members before about the fact that we have all of these projects that we apply for funding for, and then when a project receives funding, it becomes a very high priority. And so it's interesting. So things like Sandoval Montezuma intersection, for instance, got a legislative appropriation about 3 years ago. And, that wasn't exactly high on our radar. It was on our ICIP, but then, with the funding, we want to leverage what we get. So it's very dynamic from a priority perspective, and the way items make the list is from our adopted master plans and capital plans.
Thank you. Does this also, I guess I'm curious how it fits into our long range land use related needs. And you mentioned or highlighted some master plans, but we don't have long range planning staff anymore. And what's happened is we have development happening across the city in different places, and there's no one in charge of looking at like foresight of how we can potentially provide infrastructure needs that will become hotspot areas because of, development that's concentrated in an area, or we had roads that always needed support because they were older roads that never really got, and they were deferred maintenance, whatever the situation is. So I guess my concern is, how does it actually fit into the long range planning needs that we have? Because we don't have anyone tracking that, in my opinion.
Actually, yes, Chairwoman.
Land use related. I don't really see it. I think Public Works does a good job thinking about this.
Well, it's the
Holistically.
actual MPO actually, and the MPO that adopts our transportation master plan, they actually do long range planning like that. And they do have a very significant list, and we work closely with them on a regular basis. And so Councilwoman Villarreal, you've brought forward that Agua Fria really needs a bigger and more updated plan based on all the development. And so we all have actually mapped out some steps about that. And we actually have a scope for an initial assessment that would take a look at the development there. So that is raising up, and that's what happens. So transportation master plans are adopted about every 5 years, but MPO and Public Works work really closely, and we're listening to governing body feedback. We're listening to constituent feedback, traffic complaints that we get. And so it is a very dynamic situation. We are growing and we have the deferred maintenance, but I think we're balancing out, like addressing, for instance, Bishop's Lodge Road now is a high priority. It got $800,000 of funding. You know, like you said, that's one of those old roads where development has occurred and there's more and more traffic, and it really needs attention. And so we're definitely going to be adding Agua Fria to our list and really mapping out how to assess that, and then where to put the construction projects in our master plans and capital plans.
Okay, that's helpful. I think the other question, and just so you can clarify for us, that there was a question about what types of roads would be allowable for impact fee revenue use, and there was differences of opinion on the committee and versus, I think, what staff finally ultimately provided. Can you give us more information about that? It was specifically about roads, and what it says, I think, at the state level, maybe you could clarify that, but it's arterials and collector roads are available to use impact fee funds. And in this case, we're using a fund for a road to access a park, which is a large park, and it's needed, Swan Park. So not all of this is just saying that I know we have all these needs, but can you explain about the road priority?
Yes, absolutely. As I said, Patricia Fagali, the Assistant City Attorney, has been guiding the committee as well as staff through this process. And the confusion comes in that the state statute that identifies what impact fees can be used for is very vague, and it is very short. It's about one sentence, and it does say collector and main roads. But the city code actually expands on that. And then that does tie back to the state code as well for what's eligible capital projects. So the city code says anything that's in our master plan and provides needed bicycle and pedestrian access in additional volume. So the city code is much more clear, and that's what, and I think I sent a presentation to maybe one of the other committees, the same one that we gave the CIAC, and be happy to send it to you. It makes it super clear. Patricia Fagali gave a presentation about how the city code allows for, it makes it more clear what impact fees can be used for, and that includes a number of other kinds of roads. And one of the great things about that is, and we've spoken about this before, I think, is that it can prevent sprawl, because if we can only spend our money on the bigger roads, you can, only use collectors. But if you can do infill, then you can support those with smaller roads. But it also does then, bring the issue about some small roads only service a specific area, and then maybe a district would seem to be overserved. But yes, the city code does clarify and that more types of roads are eligible, and that's why Patricia Fagali supported this process, and we are here with this list.
Okay, thank you. And can you explain how impact fee funds are utilized differently than, say, ICIP funds that we get from the legislature, from bonds, or other funding sources?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question too. It is a very handy source for us for gap funding. So for instance, when we got the Harrison Road money from the legislature, we got $200,000, but we really ended up needing $600,000. And so things like that one we actually did, in the governing body actually funded that through a reallocation of the GRT bond. But this is one of those sources of funding that we can use to keep a project moving in between funding gaps from, say, DOT or the legislature. So it's very good for gap funding, which is another reason the priorities shift according to really the funds that we get by, whether it's GRT bonds or DOT or the legislature.
And so we have a hefty lift here in terms of all the projects that we have on this list of needs. And so how did you decide which ones to fill the gap? Because I think all of them really have a gap. Or I guess what would help me is to kind of understand the thinking about, out of all these projects, which ones rose to the top for impact fee gap funding, and which ones are still on the list, but you have other possibilities in mind.
That's a great question too. Any project that needs gap funding is receiving it at this moment. So there are no projects that are like need money to move forward that are not receiving funding. So there hasn't been a prioritization. They've just all been funded. If projects are not funded at all, then we are not pursuing impact fees generally. But we could say, if we get Agua Fria, for instance, on the master plan, and then it could be adopted into this table, then we could fund the city could fund us the start of that project, and then we could seek funding further. And that's actually a decent strategy right now, because as this Infrastructure Jobs Act money comes through DOT and more funding is available, say they come to us and they say, well, we need a shovel ready, and we don't have one, we could fund the design to be ready for a shovel ready invitation for funding. So all projects that need gap funding are getting it right now, and we could initiate new projects with funding if that, once we get it on the list and through the planning process.
Carmela, I know you were wanting to say something or add
thank you.
That.
Also, we use impact fees for covering the local match. All fundings need local match, and the minimum is 5% up to 25%. So we use impact fees to pay for that. So all those projects that we are adding need to cover local match. So they are included in the table.
Thank you for adding that. And I'll just add to what Rommela is pointing towards. It would be maybe helpful for the committee to know that NMDOT funds us over $4 million a year on our road projects. That's where we get most of the funding for our major road development. So the impact fees gap that, and then sometimes governing body gaps that with other funding as necessary. But generally DOT funds all of our road projects, and Rommela and the MPO work together to keep that relationship and those grants flowing.
Thank you. That was helpful. There are projects on this list. Major road improvements 2022 to 2027. So the ones on this list aren't funded, that aren't highlighted in red right now. Is that what this list means?
The highlighting in red are the additions to the table. So that's the amendment that the committee is amending right now. And it's not indicated which ones are funded and which ones are not. I think if we could provide you a separate list of funded projects. Would that be the right answer, Rommela? Yeah.
I think that would be helpful, just because when I look at this list, I'm like, what is partially funded? What is coming from this funds? Or even just telling us what are potential funding sources, so we know that, the bigger picture, because there's bond money that, potentially we can use into the future. And so it helps me to kind of look at this in a holistic way versus like, oh, okay, well, this is just a list. This is the cost estimate right now. And then there's the added projects that are in red, right? I thought all the red was also the ones that made it to the.
They just added. I would like to say that, this is making these projects eligible, and they come off our master plan and our ICIP list, really. And they are I would say the top, 20 projects probably that should come to mind for you. Adding other things like potential funding, that would be like an outside the resolution thing. But happy to, I think, giving you some visibility into what is funded and underway. Rommela has a list of her active projects that we can share with you, and it probably does list where the funding is from and how much there is. providing, I think that it would be easy to say that all the rest of the projects on the list are likely to be funded by DOT, GRT bond, or possibly GO bond. Those would be the three funding sources for our big road projects generally. And DOT, we expect, they had a lot of money last year. They've got a lot of money this year. They just got their Infrastructure Jobs Act money. We're not quite sure what the steady state will look like. It's at least $4 million a year, but it may be bigger than that. So we'll be expecting more DOT money than city money in the coming near future.
Okay. I think what's hard for me sometimes is like these conversations we have that happen at the development stage. And I'm just referencing one because I know about it because it's in District 1, but there may be others that I don't know about it. And it's actually might be before your time, even, before Romella came on. And these are like developments that there was this, there weren't conditions, but there were discussions about, we will commit to helping with a pedestrian crossing or something of that sort. And it happens at the development approval stage, and then it never makes it onto the ICIP. And that's what I'm worried about, is that, and the example that we've been talking about offline is Agua Fria, and knowing that all these developments are coming up right near Harrison Road and between Siler and, we know the section. I guess what I'm worried about is that these things get forgotten, and how can we make sure that they stay in a priority list of some sort? Because right now I'm not seeing that particular, like a potential roundabout / maybe light pedestrian crossing. We don't know yet what that would be. So I don't know. That's what worries me.
That's a great point. And this particular one that you're bringing up, as I said, it really isn't even on our transportation master plan. So it hasn't been adopted by the governing body as a priority project. And that's what Eric and I are working on, getting, that process to you. And he sent me and so that is what needs to happen. But it's a great point about, I do attend some of the planning commission meetings and keep an eye on that. But it, definitely tightening the link between development and what's said at those development plan reviews and our transportation planning. And Eric and I are definitely planning on getting together with Jason as the new land use director and really, creating that linkage and discussing more and more. We've been cooperating a lot because I'm providing the contract for the engineering review that, we're definitely working closely, but I think you're right. That's a really good place to tighten the coordination so that things come through.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's important for all of us. That's happening in our district's development, where there's this conversation about the developers wanting to contribute in some way to an infrastructure improvement. And then it just gets forgotten. And then there's no record unless you watch the meeting. And no one's going to watch the meeting necessarily. So the minutes, people won't read or go back to old meetings is what I'm saying. And so I just want to flag that, because I just feel like there's certain things that get missed that can be that are definitely potential and applicable for impact fees, and I don't want them to get missed, especially if there's a potential for a development and public-private possibility to fund something, so that we're not taking on the full cost of whatever that infrastructure need is. So,
yeah, thank you so much for that, Counselor. And I think you're right. We can definitely do better about capturing it. One instance where that wasn't missed, and it is actually happening, that the developer got an impact fee credit to put a signal at Beckner Road, where they're doing a development. Really needed signal. They're going to be putting it in there, and so that one I'm aware of that didn't get missed, but that one was agreed to quite some time ago. So it's a great point to make sure that we capture all of those agreements that come at that point.
Great. That's what I like to hear. I think that's all the questions I had. And yeah, I'm sorry I didn't understand the memo. I thought all those projects in red were going to be the ones funded. And then I was comparing it with the resolution, and I was like, this doesn't match. So I think that's it. Oh, one other thing, the impact fee balance. Do we have an audited balance for the impact fee fund?
Thank you for the question. We do not have one right at the moment. Of course, that would be pending with the audit that's being completed for fiscal year 21. And I think Director McCoy said that with the trial balance that I think is going to be produced by the end of March, that their balances for the impact fees would be known. But we've just been working off of the balance that we had from an audited balance of a year ago, and not even spending the revenue from past year, just working off the balance that we knew a year ago. So it's safe to allocate the funds that we brought forward. And we will be looking forward to that updated audit balance, so that because the parks fee fund is actually expended of the previous balance, and we need to know what's available to do further work in parks.
Great. Yeah, I think that you can only do your job if you have that amount. So we actually know what we can fund. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll be asking about that in finance, and hopefully we'll actually have some funds after this phase. We'll probably have funds left over, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. A balance is, I think, at least a couple million in roads, right? Mermello would be expecting maybe more than that, because that's what we saw in revenue from fiscal year 21. And at least another million and a half in parks. It's not a huge amount of money, really, when you think that for the most of the prices of these projects, but it is very instrumental in our success in deploying projects.
Got it. Yep, I understand. All righty. Thank you so much. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Councilwoman. Any other questions or comments from the committee? And if not, what are the wishes of the committee?
Move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Ms. Martin, can I please get a roll call?
Yes, ma'am. Councilor Michael Garcia,
Yes.
Councilor Villarreal,
Yes.
Councilor Lee Garcia,
Yes.
Councilor Chavez,
Yes.
Chair Cassette,
Yes.
motion passes.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem. I'm hearing an like a remote control car hitting against my door right now. So lots of fun noises in the background. That brings us to, we have no discussion, no executive session. Item 10, matters from staff. Do we have any matters today?
Madam Chair, there's no additional matters from staff for the meeting.
Thank you, Rich. Any matters from the committee? None. Matters from the chair? I have none. Our next meeting.
Actually, I do. Sorry, Councilwoman.
Yes.
Sorry,
Go ahead,
Chair. And this is
Councilor.
actually for Director Brown. I really would like to know what our next steps are for ARPA funds. You don't have to tell me now, but I'm just wanting to know how that's moving forward. What are we thinking? There was a request for how ARPA could be used to potentially fill the gap of funding that we could not fund for projects, that requests that we got for the CDBG and the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So I'm just letting you know, we're curious, the committee members were curious about that, and I couldn't answer the question about like where we're at with ARPA. So hopefully we'll get an update on that soon.
Madam Chair, Councilor Villarreal, yes, you will. The funding has been put into the finance department's hands. So they've been working with the mayor and the city manager and myself and Kira and some others to figure out how it's allocated. But there will be there definitely will be an update. I thought it was going to be something that would be swooped into the FY23 budgets, but I think it will be sort of separated out so we can have more engagement around how the allocations there. And to your point, I think there will be sort of buckets that are for emergency funding, like Connect, supportive housing, et cetera. I don't know how that much is allocated, but that, to your point, I think that's really kind of becomes first priority.
Right. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Thank you, Rich. Matters from the chair, I do not have any, and our next meeting will be on Wednesday, April 6, 2022 at 7:55 Mountain Time. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all so much and have a lovely evening.
Thanks.